We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, workplaces, and communities are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest, Thomas Igeme. He is the head of talent at Turn River Capital. Thomas, how's your day going?
My day is going great. I'm in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and it is a gorgeous, deceptively summer day over here.
Oh my God, that's amazing. I'm very jealous. It's not exactly summer here in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn. So I wish that I was there. But if you wanted to start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and what has recently brought you joy, this can literally be anything.
Yeah. So like you mentioned, my name is Thomas Igeme, and my pronouns are he, him. I'll first answer the question of what recently brought me joy, and then I'll share a little bit about who I am because I think they're related. What recently brought me joy was being able to visit my sister on the East Coast, which is why I'm over
Yay.
here. Yay. And I have two younger sisters. The youngest one is also coming, and we're going to be celebrating her birthday here in New Hampshire. So she'll be coming tomorrow. And so what recently brought me joy was literally blowing up the balloons and like doing that very kiddie happy birthday. We're going to get the house all like very cheesily decked out. And that's exciting for me. It's always great to play, and it's always great to be with family. That's a good segue into a little bit about me. I've been in the US. I think it's helpful to kind of go back to the beginning for this. So I've been in the US for almost 2 decades, but I was actually born and raised in Kenya. And I grew up really poor in Kenya. And I mention that because that has been really instrumental to my journey. And so for me, growing up, the opportunities that would be afforded by education, by a better life, were often like very far out there. And I knew that if I was ever going to have a hope of realizing the dreams I had for me and for my family, I was going to have to kind of cast abandon and kind of go off and seek my fortune in that very traditional immigrant way. And so came over to the US at 18 with exactly $273 to my name. I remember that like it was yesterday.
Wow.
But I'm really fortunate. I got here, taught myself to take the SATs. I got a diversity scholarship to Stanford. And really that's the opportunity that started to shift things, not just for me, but for my family. And so that connects to what brought me joy. I've been supporting my family since I was 20. Both my sisters ended up coming over for college as well.
Okay.
One's a doctor here in New Hampshire.
Awesome.
The other was a management consultant who's coming in, and they're near and dear to me, obviously, but there are also these daily reminders about the value of creating professional opportunity for people who don't have as much access to it, whether it's because their personal identities happen to look like mine or anything else. And really, I've built my career around trying to make stories like mine a little more common. And that's my passion around talent. That's my passion around D&I.
Oh my God, that is an amazing story, and what a family of high achievers. And that's absolutely, I think it's important to understand like where we come from as people and also what drives us too. So answering the question of just what inspires to wake up every day and do the work that we do. How do you think that personal journey has really led you to your current role? And I know that you recently kind of made a shift. So how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, so there are lots of ways that if you're trying to influence diversity and inclusion in the world for you to do it, lots of amazing ways. But the reason I'm really passionate about doing it in the workplace is because, at least in the Western world, that's where we spend the vast majority of our lives.
Yep.
Some would say maybe too much. And so getting that right has huge opportunity. And like you heard from my story, I know that for underrepresented minorities, it's never just about the individual employee. There's often a community with them and they go through it. And so working in the space of creating more inclusive organizations and more productive organizations so that they can like support their employees has for me always felt like the way that I want to contribute in terms of like my mission. And so The place that I found where there's the most impact to do that is in the world of talent. I've played around in that world in very many different ways. I started off as a management consultant myself. I spent time in product at LinkedIn, building products to drive sales coaching and development. I did the Silicon Valley cliche and started a startup, a learning tech startup. I was most formerly head of learning at scale for ServiceNow global tech company. And so playing around with different areas of this, but always the talent question around how do you help employees be as productive as possible, or put another way, how do you align the incentives of the individual employee, which is all around their productivity and their career growth, with the incentives of the organization that are all around the bottom line, and make those work in sing so that we all win. And in particular, those who have least access have the greatest chance of winning.
Yeah. Oh my God. I love that. I definitely agree with what you said initially too, in terms of, at least in the Western world, we spend so much of our time working or thinking about work. And over this past year, a lot of folks in corporate roles have been working remotely, and a lot of corporations are thinking about that hybrid approach. And when you're talking about learning development, especially talent, when you get that opportunity, it's about accessibility, right? It's about those resources too. How do you think really shifting this focus from a classic 9 to 5 in the office to a more remote setting really opens up accessibility to opportunities?
Um, yeah, well, in a couple of ways. I think there's literally the very obvious one, which is that once you start thinking about a hybrid or remote model, there's all of a sudden a whole new swath of the labor force that has access to jobs that they didn't otherwise have. And in particular, it's often the groups that have been historically marginalized that
Mhm.
get most access in those. And so that is a win-win for everyone in terms of accessibility. It's literally like, it doesn't matter where you live and doesn't matter where you are. And we move outside, particularly in my world of tech, the small confines of little tech hubs like Silicon Valley and Austin or New York as the only places you can be. But I think beyond that, the move to a hybrid or remote world forces a more flexible work schedule, literally forces it,
Yep.
because synchronous work is no longer as easy or possible. And so we all are learning to work more asynchronously. And the moment we're working more asynchronously, we're being more flexible. And that then brings in a whole new set of people in the labor force, people like parents or primary caretakers, in all kinds of ways, people with other passions on the side want to contribute to their things, but whole people who are more than willing to give 40 hours a week to help grow a company, but it's not going to work to do so in the traditional ways. And so that's another huge level of accessibility. And then the third is the digitization that it requires as well. And so as we're forced to digitize, we're then opened up to new avenues of accessibility. Some of my favorite stories are around how, for example, folks who are the disabled community in many of our organizations now have new access to our resources that they never did before, because things like screen readers, closed caption, etc., that are like very difficult in a live world are
Mhm.
now immediately accessible in terms of how they do that in there. And it's just been incredibly cool to see the ways that we are better able to include in our organizations in ways that we weren't even thinking about proactively when this started.
Absolutely. I think with major challenges, especially ones where there's a lot of uncertainty and there was no roadmap to this beforehand, there is an opportunity to create more equitable systems and embed inclusive design in your product or service as a business, but also for your internal employees as well. So I love that point. Another area of your work is around leadership development. And we know that at least in my opinion, managers especially are not born. You need to understand how to lead a team, motivate, lead with empathy. And there's just a whole host of other factors, especially right now with vulnerability. Are there any kind of data points that are important to capture in order to really measure and accelerate leadership development in this day and age?
Um, Absolutely. And it's going to sound really simple. Ask,
Great.
ask the teams of managers. It's surprising to me how few organizations have a pulse on how their teams feel about their managers in any real way. We ask EVS questions. We ask them how they feel about the organization. We ask them about how things are going, but don't get really tactical on how they feel about their managers. And if we do, it's generally a very binary, do you like it or do you not? Not asking
Right.
the kind of intelligent questions that are going to help us get a read on how inclusive are the teams. Do they feel like their goals are being set quickly? Do they feel like their managers support of a work-life balance? And so the data points that people need is you just need to get really clear on what the expectations are for your managers. And then you need to consistently pulse the organization on whether they're getting those and making sure that that data is then visible out to the managers. Most of the people I know who get into management want to do a good job, but they
Yeah.
have no idea what the definition of a good job is. And even if they did, how they were doing against that in any real data-driven way. And so you add those two to the organization, and you immediately can go super far. And so that was a huge thing that we did at ServiceNow, embedding that into our existing employee voice survey process. So employee voice survey always asks specific questions around what we fondly used to call our key manager behaviors, and actually gave us a pulse, right? At least twice a year on how we were trending. And the beauty is because we're able to partner with Culture Amp was our provider of choice, we're able to actually benchmark that across other companies. So I could tell you that, hey, 80% of our people managers were operating according to their teams against, like, effectively against the behaviors that we said. And that was 2% above benchmark in terms of what we were doing. And that kind of data is invaluable as you think about where you want to go.
Yeah, I think benchmarks are really important, not only to other organizations that are similar in size, but also just, what we're talking about here is not a one and done strategy. So as you're continually iterating on it, where were you last year? Where were you the year before? And where do you want to go? And keep moving the goalposts, because it just doesn't stop once you hit X number. So I think that's definitely important to note as well.
And I love that you call that out, Christina, because the continuity around data that you called out is one of the things that is so severely missing right now. I don't know how many organizations I've seen that will run a survey, identify actions, go and do them, and then run the survey again, maybe only once, if they're lucky, so it's 20%, to
Right.
see how they did and close the loop. But we all know that change never happens that quickly. And
Right.
getting really clear on what are we going to focus on and trend over time, what's going to be our true north. And that requires discipline. It means that you're not going to be moving after flavor of the month initiatives. You're really going to be trying to identify what do we believe are the key levers of performance and success, and then tracking those over time. But you build in that data set and you fast forward a year and a half, and you're just in a wildly different place as an organization. Because like you said, not only are you trending over time and individuals can see where they go, you can start to see trends across the org. Where do we have bright spots? Where are people doing really well? What's working? What made that shift in that organization that we could scale elsewhere? But you're never going to be able to do that unless you get that consistency in data over time. And that requires a consistency and focus over time as well.
Absolutely. Consistency of focus. I like how you pointed out flavor of the month. And just, I know a lot of folks are celebrating different heritage celebrations for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a part of it. It is important, but it's not the only part, right? And in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which sounds like definitely one of your something that you are passionate about as well. A lot of folks focus on metrics of recruitment and retention and promotion, which is of course really important for functional processes. But how do you really think about effectively learning programs with a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion as well, knowing that people are coming in with different backgrounds and different levels of interest to like learn about different things in the organization?
Got it. Yeah, well, when I think it comes, and I love how you thought through it. Some of the ways that I've heard this defined before is if you think about equity as equity of processes and diversity as kind of what your talent pipeline looks like and who you're coming in and how diverse that is, I think that middle piece that you're talking about where learning ends up playing a role is on inclusion, which is what are the day-to-day mindsets and behaviors in this org, and do they foster the greatest number of people being able to share their ideas and make this place great. And in terms of what I found to be really effective to get there, is actually really embedding, like you said, our inclusion goals into our overall leadership and development goals. I'm like a big believer. I don't believe in seeing inclusive or D&I goals over here and general learning goals over there. I think
Right.
that goes across the point. I don't believe in like recruiting goals and then diversity recruiting goals.
Mhm.
Those should be one and the
Right.
same thing. Either we believe that this is really important to driving organization forward, or we don't. So I think that's the first philosophical way. And so the first thing is believe that philosophically, and then you just get really clear. What are the inclusive metrics that we're trying to go after around a sense of belonging, around where we're trying to go? And then once you're clear on that, it's just how does all our learning and leadership build into that as we go through? And so, that is what I've done in the organizations that I've partnered with in the past. And so many times folks aren't even going in considering a training to be about D&I. My favorite example of this is like when we're training managers, it's just our manager boot camp. But we all know that good leadership is inclusive leadership, right? You're not really talking about leadership if you're not asking questions about how we make sure that we are effectively leading everyone on the team. And so embedding that stuff as we go is really important. And so you get that then in the goals, and then you, like we said, where we started off, you just measure against it, right? You don't just measure it in terms of did people think they learned it, but you connect it to the behaviors. Do the teams actually feel like there's a correlation between the investment in development that our leaders are making and the sense of inclusion on the teams? And getting those correlations gets really, really fascinating for us as we go through.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'm hearing you say is you really set an intention and think through a really meaningful strategy of what you're trying to accomplish, and then you measure it. And if it doesn't work, then you try something else, and you just keep making sure that you're keeping a pulse on what's happening, and also not thinking or making assumptions around what employees need, want, and what they want to learn as well. And just having that two-way conversation too.
Yeah, absolutely. One really wise thing that you just said, Christina, I want to reiterate is the learning posture. I think one of the things that we're often kind of afraid to admit right now in the world of D&I, particularly because it's so important, is
Mhm.
how much nobody really has the answer. If we did, we'd be trying to scale what they did. But there's no organization I know. There's some that are doing better than others, but there's no organization that I know in the US right now that would say they're where they want to be when it comes to D&I.
Yeah.
And so by definition, we are all learning, and that's the power of data. Because if you just launch something without the right kind of tracking and measurement overall, then either we fail or we
Mhm.
succeed. And most of the time we'll fail. But if you take a learning mindset, we're just looking at data. We are merely learning what doesn't work. And I think we have to be ready to understand that a lot of what we're going to try is not going to work. And in fact, if everything we're trying works, then we're probably not thinking riskily and big enough, because quite frankly, the challenge in front of us is too monumental and too important and has been entrenched for too long for us to be using the same old attempted solutions to try and solve it. And so the power of getting really clear on that data is freeing us up from the need to be perfect and
Mhm.
truly making us learners around what works for our organization and what doesn't and where do we want to go. Just love that you called that out.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate it. And that's something that I believe. And I think a lot of people at companies and organizations have a variety of different passions, and they want to be learners. They want to be upskilling. And we're seeing in kind of the market right now as well, a lot of companies are looking to offer like levels of whether it's training internally or programs like LinkedIn Learning, or other kind of softwares that really help employees with either technical skills or soft skills, conferences, etc. There might not be like a right or wrong way to do this, but in your opinion, do you think it's more effective to have that set L&D budget of just like X number of dollars, and the individual employee chooses what they would like to do with it, or for job functionality or overall company have a platform that's for everyone and it's centralized?
That makes my answer will be yes. And the reason is I think both are important, but I would say that like when I think about it relatively, I do think it's really important to start with a clear strategy and a clear goal. I
Yeah.
think many companies kind of start with just throwing a budget and throwing people at that and
Yes.
get all, and that's wonderful if you're looking at learning and development as a perk, but it's not going to cut it if you're viewing it as a strategic imperative. Because the difference between it being a perk and a strategic imperative is that it's connected to your performance goals. And if it is connected to your performance goals, then it's not willy-nilly and everything doesn't work. And we also, just think about like where the power of our dollars, we can either, and this is what I will say, you can either give $1 to 100,000 people and change no one's life, or give $100,000 to one person and completely transform a life. And that's how I think about our dollars in L&D. It's important to have focus, to go after what is most important for us to move in. And so absolutely, that's what I've done. There are a number of great organizations that really will partner with you around that. One of my favorite is Hone. We actually partnered with them recently at ServiceNow for our manager development, and that manager bootcamp that I mentioned, embedding it with diversity and inclusion, we partnered deeply with them, and then we're able to hand that over to them. So it's a 14,000 person organization. No way that we on our own as a small L&D team are going to be able to go through. We were able to really empower them with our vision of that learning and have them go through. But it doesn't matter who your partner is, but having a clear strategy and making the job of the L&D team not so much focus on how do we build learning or offer learning, but how do we understand performance goals and build a learning strategy around that, and then partner with the right people to help us deliver is key to success.
Yeah, I've never heard the kind of comparison to whether it's a perk. I think a lot of companies I've worked at or just like seen in the news is just offering it as a perk, but offering it as a strategic imperative is a totally different conversation, and it needs to be addressed as so and thought of. And the second thing I heard you say in terms of strategy is, and I think it relates to your earlier point too, is nobody is a subject matter expert on everything. There are people who are doing this for a living and have so much more time, and to really scale this out and get the most effective people in there for these trainings, you need to partner with organizations. You need to partner with internal people as well who are outside of your job function, who might have the experience and be open to that collaboration too.
Yeah.
When you're thinking about just like training managers, how have you really thought creatively and shifted your perspective, especially around just the changing role of managers over this year? How have you kind of thought about doing that in terms of like up-leveling them?
That makes total sense. So one of the things is, we realize that while we'll have our big strategic imperatives, the world is changing so fast that like the challenges our managers are facing are going to, our content will always be outdated if we think of ourselves as this like ivory tower on high with all of the wisdom. Our job was really about helping the managers surface not just the problems, but the solutions in the org. And so we actually went with, it's one of the reasons that we did virtual live as a really core focus. And even though we had 14,000 people, so I mentioned partnering with Hone, we had them in groups of 8, really working through a key curriculum, but spending most of that time with a coach, engaging and coming up with their own solutions. I think the other thing that we did is we recognized that we needed to adjust to a world in which while it's great that we need to be virtual and we can be live, everybody is zoomed out. We're all kind of exhausted of coming in there. And so we partnered with a couple of cool organizations that have learning opportunities that don't just require you to be in front of a screen. My favorite example of that is Spoken, which is an internal podcasting software. And so we were able to use that. And there are a number of others in the market, but we absolutely love that from a UX perspective. But what that allowed us to do is actually take our content and turn that into really mini podcasts that people could listen to in 2 to 10 minutes and just do it as they were working out, on their run, etc., all connected to our overarching strategy. The coolest thing about using Spoken is we're able to actually add our own content. So we throw in words from our leaders, like messages in terms of strategic direction, and pulling all of that through. We also are experimenting with using text-based learning as well to keep it engaging. And so working through that. And what kind of connects all of these pieces is what we recognized we needed to do to meet our managers where they were at is more variety in the how of the learning even as we remained super clear on the what, and also a move towards social connection and social learning over kind of unidirectional learning as well.
I love that. I think meeting employees and just managers and people where they are is so important, because not only are they different folks, they're also coming in with different learning styles. So some people might like to listen to things as opposed to reading. Some people are, like myself, visual learners. So I think offering a variety of ways to just understand information is important. And one of the questions that I also had was around that onboarding process. When you have a lot of eager folks who are coming into an organization, they want to learn as much as possible, prove their value early on. How do you think about creating intentional and non-overwhelming programs there? Is it similar to kind of what you just outlined with managers?
Similar, except we're even more clear on the journey with our new managers.
Okay.
And I think one of the challenges with onboarding is it typically, people kind of are between a rock and a hard place. Either there's just too little given and people are thrown to the wolves, or there's too much given where people are getting a ton of information before they have the context to properly localize it. And then it's still wasted time.
Right.
And so what we've shifted is, I don't think of onboarding as a class, a series of classes, etc. I
Yeah.
think about it as the first 12 months and your path to peak productivity. And so there's a very intentional journey across your first 12 months in terms of what you're going to get. What that allows us to do is space things out, really ask the question, when do you need to know what? It also allows us to really optimize initially, not on what they need to know, but how they feel connected. What we found is that the biggest kind of marker to onboarding, or the biggest lever to onboarding success, wasn't us figuring out the perfect information for every single person. It's a varied org, there's lots of people going, but helping them feel connected enough to the org and to specific mentors in the org so that they can ask their unique questions. And so that's where we start off, and then start dripping the information as they're going to need it. One of the other things that we really did when I was at ServiceNow, which is probably unusual for most people focus executive coaching right at the top. We purposefully invest 4 months of executive coaching right for our first-time managers, based off of what you said, Christina. It is the most important role in the organization. And we owe it not just to them, but quite frankly, to all the people who are working to set them up for success. And so we choose to invest our dollars that way. And that's been huge in terms of what we've seen, because it is a really tough role. And especially if you're a new manager in a new org in particular, the need for that personalized support is always going to be essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's interesting as well, to really front end that training. And for folks who don't know the difference between kind of manager training and executive leadership training, can you just briefly explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's kind of like, what do I think of? I'll answer it in terms of, what do I think of as the difference between a people manager and an executive?
Yeah, that's a
because, and then both of them need development across it. A people manager is responsible for the people in the org. There's a team, there's a broader set of team, and primarily when we think about developing them, we're trying to give them the skills that they need to unlock the potential of the individuals on their team. But fundamentally, their job is thinking about individuals. As an executive, your job is thinking about the business. Now, those two aren't it. They're executives who manage people, they're people leaders who will be executives. But when we're thinking about like the executive skill set, we're really thinking about the business as a whole, the org as a whole, and how do you plan long-term to set that up for success? So it's actually very same question on unlocking potential, but rather than thinking of the unit as the individual, you're thinking of the unit as the organization and the business as a whole. So in much the same way that like a people manager would be thinking about what are kind of the what's the performance of this individual? What are the gaps? Where do I need them to come in and grow in? An executive is thinking about, what's the sense of the org? What's the skill sets that we have represented? How do we need to think about our hiring flow in order to get there? What are the different bets that we want to make, et cetera?
Thank you. That's definitely really, really helpful just to differentiate the two, even though if you think of the Venn diagram, they're not totally separate, they're overlapping
Yeah.
in terms of goals and strategies. We talked about kind of a lot of different folks at an organization with a common goal of a lot of people want to learn about the organization and up level their skills. But when you're doing so many things, especially if you are remote, it could feel really overwhelming. And burnout is a really hot topic of conversation right now. How do you really think about, especially with like people managers and folks who are just like really supporting their team to prevent burnout?
Got it. So I think there's the tactical, and then there's the tactical, the strategic, and then what I'd call the mindset. And so let's look at it. So I think tactically, it's a lot around how do you create rhythms as a team that are going to protect you against burnout. Really simple things like no meeting days. Are you going to intentionally take time off? And doing that as a team so that we
Yeah.
avoid risk of hurting each other,
Mhm.
but thinking about that at every level. So there's thinking about that in terms of days off, but there's thinking about it in terms of times in the day. I don't see nearly enough teams that block off daily hours not to engage in order to get their work done.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely critical. It works in the same way that blocking off a whole day will, or so on and so forth. So that's really kind of the tactical stuff. And that's really all around like just work-life blend. Like, how do you create space for people to do focused work? How do you space for people to do it outside? I think more strategically, there's a question around prioritization. The question around time. Time is often this very distracting, or the sense of lack of time or overwhelm is a bit of this red herring, because ultimately the real question is what's the most impactful way for us to use the time that we have available? And that's a prioritization question. And so having more clear strategic conversations, not just around what our priorities are, but revisiting those. Not nearly enough teams set annual goals and look at them through the year and ask what needs to change as we go through. But then I think the last piece is a mindset piece. I mean, we invest a lot about that in terms of helping people think about managing their energy, not their time. Burnout is a lack of energy, not a lack of time. And yet very often we're just looking at managing our calendars. How do we think about the values energy, the inspiration, the creativity, the sense of play in people's day and weeks, and how do we give them the tools that they need to invest in their energy along the way so that they can show up as their best?
I love that. I feel like we're on the same wavelength because you use the term work-life blend, and I think intentionally not balance.
Yeah.
And I also believe in that as well, because I don't think anything is going to be equally leveled or perfect at any given time. That's not how life works.
Yeah.
And also, I think you're right in terms of it being an energy, not a time and prioritization problem here, and really thinking about that from those different perspectives. Have you
Yeah.
read the book, Pleasure Activism?
I've not. Should I? It
I
sounds
would
like
definitely recommend. It's by Adrienne Ray Brown. I will send you the link, but there is a quote in there that's called "Joy is not frivolous," because it's really important to the work that we do, whether it's activism or kind of our jobs as well. But that's what it reminded me of when you're talking about factoring in time to really, do a heads down work, but also just rejuvenate yourself. So
yeah.
just wanted to
Yeah.
bring that up.
No, I love that. And one, I will definitely look that up. So thank you, Christina. And just plus one on the investing, that this is a real skill. And it's a skill that too many of us are just not all that equipped in. How do we manage our energy? How do we invest in your, how do we think about that in terms of our workday? And so we, in the past, and I will continue to do this, really invest in skill building around work-life blend. It isn't just about time off. It requires a whole new mindset and ways of doing it. And there's some fantastic partners out there that are able to help with that. And we've had like massive success bringing those in as well.
That's great. Again, bringing it back to people who have been doing this work for way longer than we have been talking about it, and bringing them into the process. Is there a trend that you would like to reemphasize, or that you want to bring up in terms of L&D that individuals and companies need to hone in on in order to really be successful in the future?
Yes, I think there are a couple, and I'll go through them. I think the first is this around social learning. Like the pace of change is only going to be increasing for us. And if we keep needing to kind of sit down and identify what the right answer is or what people need to know up there, we will always be too slow. And so I think the first trend is like, how do you create more connection across your manager base, employee base, et cetera, so they can learn from each other? No matter what one person's having a challenge with, somebody else has already figured out. How do you think of your role as creating connection rather than creating content? The second trend, I think, is around just variety of learning styles. I mean, we've always known this to be true, but I think the attention spans of each subsequent generation coming into the workforce get smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
And so, whether you're using things like we are, like, the podcasting software I talked about with Spoken, or texting, or just figuring out ways to keep it fresh, making sure that you're really thinking about how you will create a learning experience that is exciting and engaging and not stale, I think is going to be absolutely critical. And then the third piece was just around the strategic imperative versus the perk. I think increasingly employees aren't satisfied with learning as just a perk. They're hungry for it, but they're hungry for it because they want to progress in the org.
Right.
And the only way that you make sense of that is by making sure that the learning that they're doing is related to the things that are going to help them succeed. And so that shift, I think, is actually think there's a push factor from our employees around thinking about learning more strategically and having more of a perspective around what they need to truly succeed in our organizations. And I think that learning and development organizations moving from a perk providers to truly partnering with functional leaders to identify strategic imperatives is going to be the third to pay attention to.
I love that. And I definitely agree. If you get to the why of why people want to learn more and what skill they want to up level, it comes down to the career journey. And it's better for everyone if it's a strategic imperative as well, aside from just a perk and a nice to have, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
Shifting a little bit to kind of yourself too, is there anything that folks would be surprised to know about you?
Oh, I think there's a lot about me. I will pick the fact that I still don't have a driver's license. I've always lived in
Not missing out.
I didn't have to drive, and I'm deeply embarrassed about that. But yeah.
That's okay. I hate driving, but I would never have known that. Would have been shared. And I'm sure that you have many of them throughout your career, but is there a proudest moment, whether it's a big win or a small win, where you were in a moment of flow that you want to share with us too?
I'll go back to some of the work that I did when I was a group product manager around coaching products and trying to help develop managers into excellent coaches. Everybody's really excited about coaching, but it's often hard to talk about the ROI. We're able to launch a coaching program, one former company I was at, for the sales organization, and we run a true A/B test where we gave half our managers the right products and tools to encourage coaching and use the other half as our control. And over 3 quarters, we saw a 20% rise in quota attainment.
Wow.
And if you're familiar with the world of sales, that's like unheard of. Like,
yeah.
We'd be writing about
incredible.
But it's both like unbelievable and then also really intuitive, because if I talk to any sales leader and ask them, how much value do you think would be available if your sales managers more consistently coached? I'd actually probably say we were underballing it with like 20%. There's probably like 50% of value.
That's insane.
So I'm just super proud of that, though, for like the little part that we played in quantifying what the impact of that was, and very specifically how you were the right mechanisms for creating that change in that coaching behavior that can unlock business value.
That's awesome. That's a great proudest moment with a huge ROI for the business as well.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, we have ranged the gamut from our conversation, and I feel like the time has flown by. Is there anything else that you would like to share, or a key insight that you just want to just bold, underline, highlight for the folks who are listening?
Maybe the last insight I'd love to give is, we've talked a lot about the role of the organization and making career development a strategic, learning and development a strategic imperative, et cetera. But I'll speak in closing to just the average individual employee.
Yeah.
Nobody cares about your career as much as you do. And so don't wait for anybody else other than you to be responsible for where it goes. I'll say that again. Nobody will care about your career as much as you do. And so don't wait for anybody else to make those decisions instead of you. Figure out what you want, go after it. Don't wait for all of these lovely programs that I'm talking about. Like, that's the flip side of it.
Yeah.
Your career is just too important to wait for leadership to get it right. And if you make that investment and you're intentional about reaching out to the right mentors, the right learning opportunities, et cetera, promise you that that intention is going to yield massive results. So take a step, stop waiting and stop asking, and instead start doing.
What a call to action to end on for our folks who are listening. I definitely believe that you're your best advocate. So I love that as a note to end on. Thomas, thank you so much for your time and insights. It was so great speaking with you this afternoon.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Christina.
Of course. And as a reminder for our listeners, AllVoices believes in the empowerment of everyone to speak up at an organization and believes that it's a requirement in order for everyone to succeed. We'll speak soon.